think we'll make a start, everybody. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Tava Olsen. I'm the Director of the Supply Chain Centre here. And I'd like to welcome you here and do the housekeeping. In case of emergency, it's easiest to go out that door and the second corridor on the left. You'll follow all the exit signs, but just follow me or Marcus. And for restrooms, it's easiest to go that way and just follow the corridor around and find on your right. And hand this over to Marcus to introduce our speaker.
Thanks. Welcome everybody, kia ora. Thank you for making it on this cold, wintry Auckland night. I'd also like to welcome everybody who is being live streamed from around the country and around the world. We have Kate Nicholl is going to be talking to us about sustainability risk in the supply chain. Kate is head of State of Flux for Auckland and New Zealand, and she's a lecturer and researcher at the University of Melbourne, not Auckland University. So what we'd like to do is, at the end of the presentation, we're going to have questions from the audience here and then questions online, from the online audience. There's going to be about 10-15 minutes of questions. And then after that, we've got drinks and nibbles on the social bridge just down the corridor. So please welcome Kate.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. First, I just want to apologise for my voice. I'm going to stand here so I'm a bit closer to the microphone. I had a really nasty flu about a month ago, and I'm fine now, but my voice just seems to. I'm starting to think it might be permanently damaged. I'm definitely not sounding like myself. So I'll do my best to. Project my voice, speak up a bit. So, as Marcus mentioned, I'm the head of Australia and New Zealand for State of Flux. So, we're a consultancy that focuses specifically on supplier relationship management. We do some work around looking at sourcing, contract management, those types of things. But our main reason for existence is to look at supplier relationship management. So, helping our clients to look at better ways to work with their suppliers to attain more, to attain mutual value, to reduce risk, and we do that through consulting, but we also do that through training, where we have a partnership with CSCM, so it's accredited training, and we also have a technology platform for supplier collaboration that we call Status. And just for me individually, so I have worked with State of Flux for the last 3 years, but I've had a career in supply chain consulting and in industry before that. And I also work at the University of Melbourne, where I lecture in the Department of Business and Economics, or the Faculty of Business and Economics in Supply Chain Strategy. And I'm going to talk about one of the research projects that we've been doing in the last 12 months around supply chain sustainability as well, looking at the seafood industry. So I'm going to use that as a bit of a case study when it comes to supply chain sustainability and what kind of risks there are and why it's important. So, the main thing that I've been asked to speak about today is sustainability in the supply chain and why and how it's a risk. Increasingly, being as an SRM or supply chain management consultancy, a lot of our clients are starting to come to us now going, the legislation is starting to change in terms of what we're requiring of our suppliers and our suppliers and suppliers. And or they've had a so they've been pinged in social media or something like that for something that may have occurred. And so they've been coming to us saying, how do we handle this? How do we do a modern slavery statement? How do we make sure that our supplier code of conduct covers, all of the types of risks that we really do face in our extended supply chain? The structure of a supply chain has changed in the last 30 years. Rather than being just, locally produced goods that you can physically go and inspect and talk to the people who are making it, supply chain has now become a large global network, which becomes very difficult to get your hands around and to get visibility of. And so because of that, there's a huge number of risks, both environmental and social, that exist in your supply chain that you may not necessarily have that visibility of. So there's a number of reasons about why you worry about that. I guess, on the bottom of that slide there, I've said because it's the right thing to do. I guess everybody here in this room is a consumer. So as an individual, you want to be aware of the types of risks that may be in the supply chain of the products you own. Someone's taking a picture of me there, and the electronic, wherever that's been made and who's made it and who made the componentries. And also the clothes that we wear, the food that we buy. And then also as corporate buyers, we've got another set of responsibility to be vigilant in terms of what these types of risks might be. So really you can't consider yourself to be a sustainable organisation unless you've looked at the inputs into the organisation through your supply chain. So, if you're looking as an organisation to reduce your carbon footprint, you can't really do that without looking at the impact that within your supply chain and the performance of your suppliers in that instance. There's also changing legislation. The biggest one that's been facing us in Australia has been the introduction of modern slavery legislation. So that was introduced in the UK in 2015, and it was tabled at a parliamentary inquiry last year and being discussed as a bill in Parliament just next week. And so what that legislation requires organisations to do is to present a statement that actually talks about what it is that they have done to trace their supply chain and make sure that there's no evidence of slavery within their extended supply chain. So that doesn't just mean your suppliers, it means the contractors of your suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers. So it's a very tricky thing to do. A lot of our clients have a lot of trouble just understanding who their first tier of suppliers are, let alone getting visibility further into the supply chain. And then the other reason why, as an organisation, you might want to consider supply chain sustainability as a risk is being on the front page of a newspaper. So one of the big industries that's made quite a lot of advancement in terms of tracing their supply chain and addressing issues in the supply chain would be the apparel industry or the garment industry, and that's because in 2013 a factory collapsed. Some of you may be aware of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 where 1,100 people died as a result, and they were making clothes purely for export. So really it was just public dissent and public outrage that really then forced companies to start taking actions to be able to trace their supply chain down to, looking at where the yarn comes from, the dye, the cotton, not just from their manufacturing facilities in Bangladesh or China or wherever that might be. So I mentioned before about working at Melbourne University. So I have a team, work with a small research team there, and we spent 2017 looking at the seafood supply chain. We specifically wanted to focus on Thailand because we had been aware that the EU had issued a yellow card for trade with Thailand as a result of it coming to light around slavery on boats in Southeast Asia. So we wanted to dive a bit deeper into that and to look at all of the members within the seafood supply chain and look at what type of issues there really were. So this is just an excerpt from the newspaper from when we were there last year. So the yellow card had been issued by the EU in 2015, and then in 2016 it was reviewed and it was upheld because they were given 6 months to make a number of changes, and the government did just make some legislative changes in terms of looking at being able to encourage change in the seafood industry, but that hadn't been quite enough. So the yellow card had been upheld. So in terms of the seafood industry, the reason why this occurs is that Thailand is the 3rd largest seafood exporter in the world. So in 2013, it was estimated about €7 billion worth of seafood was exported, and the majority of that went to the EU. And Thailand is actually, the economy is very strong, so there's a very low percentage of unemployment in Thailand. So as a result, they rely really heavily on migrant labour. And so the migrant labour tends to come over the border from Thailand and Myanmar. And then those migrant workers don't have access to the same types of rights that the Thai workers do. So they're not paid a minimum wage as Thai workers are, and they also don't have access to a union voice or be able to assemble themselves in a union. These types of issues that occurred both in the shelling sheds and the processing factories, as well as out on boats. And during that time, after the yellow card had been issued, there'd been quite a significant change that was made in the processing plants, and that was because you can physically go and inspect the processing plants, but when it comes to being out on the water, it's a lot harder to monitor. And some of the more scrupulous fishermen actually then just took the boats further out into the high seas and had trawlers come out and just take their catch, so that crew would pretty much be held captive on that boat. So this actually became quite a well-known news story in 2015. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about it, you can Google a lady called Robin McDowell. She led the Associated Press investigation on slavery on boats in Thailand. For a year, they traced a number of boats through Indonesia and through Thailand. And then when they published their work, it led to the release of around 2,000 workers who were actually held in the waters off Indonesia. And so that then led to a number of other media outlets doing the same type of thing. The New York Times did a 7-series piece on it as well, looking at slavery on boats, particularly in Southeast Asia. So if I wasn't a vegetarian before I went, I definitely was after this. We actually did go and have a look at the factory where John West, the John West Australia and New Zealand John West brand is packaged in, or one of them, in Thailand. This factory was a factory of about 1,300 workers, and pretty much 100% of them were migrant workers. It's a pretty busy place, pretty smelly place. And one of the things that we started to learn when we were doing our investigation was that a number of the NGOs, there are a number of NGOs in Thailand who are really assisting with driving change on the ground, both with the within the actual on the boats and then also in the factories as well. You know, I guess when you think about some of the NGOs like a Greenpeace or something similar, what you really kind of think of is, you know, some pirate-like guys out on a sea shepherd chasing down guys doing the wrong thing. But there's been quite a shift in sophistication of the way that some of these NGOs are actually tackling these kinds of problems at each level of the supply chain, from the retailers all the way through to the boats, and playing quite a significant role in upskilling business and also helping the producers to be able to improve and lift their standard around the way that they treat workers, the conditions of workers, etc. So, you know, why does this occur? Initially in Thailand, I mean, the environmental issues are quite well known when it comes to, you know, tuna, seafood, but less so when it comes to the social issues, but they do go hand in hand, because things like illegal fishing, overfishing, using the incorrect types of vessels, which all lead to, you know, the environmental issues that we know, then leads to a declining amount of catches and fish that can be be put up for sale. So then that means that there's pressure on reducing cost, and also the vessels, and this is the key thing, the vessels need to spend longer away out at sea. So you know, that gives less freedom of movement to the workers who are spending more time actually on the boats. And then you couple that with inadequate inspections and visibility of those boats and labour shortages in Thailand, and that's how we end up with a number of migrant workers who are working in compromised situation. So the other thing that we interviewed around 25 organisations, from, you know, the ultimate customer through the retailer, through to the proprietary brands, the processors, the exporters, and then fishing and the agents. And then we looked at a number of NGOs as well. The different types of issues that lead to social sustainability risk is different at each of the nodes of the supply chain. So, you know, at the retailer end, there's really just a lack of transparency and a lack of visibility about where the raw materials of the seafood that we're eating are actually coming from. So because customers don't know, they're not putting any pressure or asking any questions of those retailers, and so it's just something that kind of just continues on without any awareness. Then we have issues around forced labour within some of the processing plants, and then there's slaves on boats, to put it crudely. The use of the equipment and the type of the boat can also have an impact on the conditions for the workers. But then as we were doing each of these interviews at each of the different nodes of the supply chain, we found that there are a number of different NGOs that were working with each of the different players, and they're taking a different type of role. So when we interviewed Simplot, who own the John West brand in Australia, they've made a really significant move forward in terms of transparency in their seafood supply chain, and addressed really a lot of the environmental and social issues that can occur. And so we asked them, you know, why have you invested in this when some of your competitors haven't invested in this yet? And they said the reason was that Greenpeace had come and chained themselves to the roofs and come down until they signed an agreement to say that they would. So the kind of power that these guys can have, and it's actually, when we interviewed Greenpeace, they said that when it comes to advocacy and raising awareness and campaigning, their strategy is to target the big fish, so to speak, the big player in the market. and to really pull them down so that then it can raise awareness and drive change to all of the other players. And so John West as a brand globally was targeted by Greenpeace quite effectively. And they've also done the same with Thai Union, who's a very big exporter in Thailand, in terms of campaigning and raising awareness about the different types of labour abuses that may or may not occur in their operations. But then there's a number of other NGOs that sort of, rather than campaigning and advocacy like that, they work more as a partner with business. So they're working particularly right at the very front lines. They're working with the fishing lines and they're working with the processing plants to help them to support the workers and to make sure that they are checking all the right boxes when they're working with, labour hire companies and those types of things. One NGO that we've worked with and we've looked at in Bangkok had created a whole lot of social media platforms in all of the local languages, so Khmer, Khmer from Cambodia and Burmese, etc., so that they were able to share information, if they were not just about whether, they were treated unfairly, but also if they needed medical care or they were looking for a dentist, they were able to get the information that they need to be able to live safely and comfortably in the local environment. So our research shifted quite strongly over to the power of NGOs in raising awareness around this topic and also in terms of being a partner to business to drive transformation. So, I guess the key takeaway from that research was that governments play a really big part. The changing legislation is something that creates a level playing field for everybody. So I mentioned before that John West made an investment in that, but to their own disadvantage financially because their competitors were not made to do the same. The other is that the media and NGOs can really cause a lot of grief if you choose to stay in denial about this and they choose to target you. One airline that I've done some work with was caught out on social media when someone was travelling on one of their planes and they turned over the packet of the snack that they had and it had palm oil in the ingredients, and the passenger took a photo of it and put it on Twitter. And it can be that easy now to get caught out. If it's an influential person, then it can be quite difficult. The other is that global retailers, as well as us as consumers, need to consider ourselves part of the problem. So, these are the types of things that we are benefiting from, even if it's not a choice of our own, but that's where the product comes from, and we really need to start demanding to have visibility, both as corporate buyers as well as individual consumers. And that, NGOs, if we engage with them, can be a really strong partner for business and for individuals as well. So within the remit, within State of Flux, I guess, as I mentioned before, a lot of our clients have been coming to us and saying, how do I tackle this? And I guess this slide here is what our high-level methodology is. We've been working with a number of clients over the last year now to really try and refine and develop this. And the first thing, really, phase one in and of itself is a very difficult thing. So to do a diagnostic and to look at where you're actually at right now in terms of your sustainability practices with engaging with your suppliers, looking at developing a framework for sustainable procurement. So what's the policy? Is the supplier code of conduct, is it enough? Does it cover all of the relevant risks? Doing some change management within the organisation, because it's not just procurement and supply chain who are dealing with suppliers, project managers, engineers, all of those types of people are also making purchasing decisions. key suppliers. So to set up that framework to understand what does sustainability mean for us, what are the relevant risks for our industry, and it is different whether you're whether you're an airline, whether you're a mining company. The risks will be, there's a lot of risks that are just inherent, but then there's different things that you need to prioritise depending on the industry. And then we have actually partnered with a technology platform that helps to survey suppliers. So once we've done an initial risk screening, and it's like a supplier segmentation, but we would segment your suppliers, not on the traditional sort of risk and spend focus, but looking at it a lens of what type of category it is, versus where the product comes from. So something like a filter that comes from Pakistan, you might only spend $500,000 a year on it, but it might come out as number one, and we do that initial risk analysis. And so then we'll start surveying suppliers. So if you've got 5,000 suppliers, you're not going to survey all of them in the first hit. So we do an initial risk screening, and then we determine which ones we want to do first. And then we do that through a reiterative process. So for those that you determine to be high risk, we may then go to tier 2 suppliers, and then more targeted third-party audits with more informed decision making. It might not necessarily be the supplier that you spend the most amount of money on with that you're focusing on when you're looking at your supply base through this lens. So those first 2 phases, generally for the projects we've been doing, take about 4 months. So 2 months to set up the policy, the handbook, to do the internal change management, and then another 2 months to do the initial survey. But this is really a change process that needs to be, it's a mindset change, and it's also quite labour intensive to do the survey, so it takes a lot of commitment to you really need to understand why it's important to the organisation. We also we worked with Ausgrid. Ausgrid was actually our pilot client when working through this methodology. So the first thing that we did with Ausgrid was spend quite a long time developing a definition of what sustainable procurement means for them. So we developed an elevator pitch. It's still pretty dense, but we developed an elevator pitch that helps them to define exactly what sustainable procurement is for them. And they decided that they wanted sustainable procurement not just to be about harm reduction, so making sure that there's no slaves in their supply chain, making sure that all of their suppliers have environmental policies, but also they wanted to be able to use their corporate spend to have a positive impact on the community through being sure that they're sourcing from companies that have a good balance of gender ownership, Indigenous ownership, and also sourcing from social enterprises that employ people with disability, those types of things. So we worked out what their drivers were. They were similar to what we said before. They want to make sure that they're attracting talent, and by doing that, they need to be seen to be an organisation that you'd want to work for, and you don't want to work for an organisation that's harming the environment and the community. That they can meet legislative change, meet board expectations, and just because it's the right thing to do. The outcome of the first phase was to develop an external facing document, an internal facing document, so that sustainable procurement policy was an internal document that helped them to communicate to the rest of the organisation how we buy things sustainably and why. And the supplier code of conduct communicated to the suppliers what they expect from them as a result. And then we wrapped all of that up into a handbook, which is like a reference guide about why sustainable procurement is important, how to do it, etc. We've worked out with them what their short-term priorities were and what their long-term priorities were. And the short-term priorities were really just in that 4-month time frame, just to get a model working and to do their initial survey and start to then embed it in their way of working. In their longer-term or medium or longer-term priorities were around being signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. My voice is starting to fail now. And also to be able to comply with changes in legislation. So I guess, from what I talked about today, the thing to really take away from this is that what you buy really does count. One of the things that we talked about at Ausgrid, and one of the things that they were conscious of, was about being complicit in these types of environmental and human rights abuses by benefiting from the result of it. And we do that. We sort of don't be mindful about what it is that we buy. So you can inform yourself as a consumer, and then also as a corporate buyer about what are the ethical sources to obtain materials from, and to really understand the complexity of the supply chain, not just your first tier of suppliers, but to understand and ask where the materials are coming from and what type of risk there is within that, and to really understand. I've talked a lot about social sustainability because that's my really core area of knowledge, but from an environmental perspective, a lot of the risks are already well known, but slavery is much more subversive in terms of being able to get your hand around it and to see it and touch it. But it really does still exist. I could pick up any number of items that are in the room right now and talk about exactly how it could manifest in the supply chain of that product. So we have a responsibility in terms of thinking about how we spend our money and how it can contribute to the continuation of those types of issues. So, anyone have any questions?
Kate, in terms of being able to assist this customer awareness, how much action or how many solutions are being looked at in a digital scope, such as using blockchain to add QR codes onto products to enable people to have full transparency of where every single piece of that product's originated from?
Yeah, I must be the only person in the world who doesn't have a slide on blockchain in their presentation these days. I guess anything that enables visibility is what's going to be able to create the solution. I don't claim to be a blockchain expert, so I can't really talk to blockchain, but there are a number of technology solutions that can help with the visibility. So I mentioned before that we have a partnership with a company called Inform 365, and that actually is a mapping technology where you can survey your suppliers through that platform, and then you can also do the same then with your suppliers, and it will give you this global view of your supply chain map, and then you can overlay that with a number of different types of apps. So you can overlay it with the UN Global Disaster Index, and it'll then show you where all of the earthquakes and cyclones and whatever are happening in the world, and will overlay that over your supply chain and give you an indication about where you might have risk. So you can do the same then with any type of index, global modern slavery index, the Dow Jones supply chain sustainability index, etc.
Kate, you mentioned in one of your early slides about illegal fishing. We talk about illegal practices that are illegal by the law of the land or by international law, or some combination thereof. In Thailand, for example, Thailand may have very, very lax laws. I know that it may be quite illegal in that country, but not stack up very well to what's considered to be okay in the realm of the rest of the world.
Yeah, so illegal fishing. So as you said, a combination of both. So a lot of the boats will be unregistered or not be equipped adequately. So it was quite lax within Thailand in terms of doing that in those inspections and ensuring the compliance with legislation, and that did actually lead to some of those outcomes that I talked about before. So there's been, through the EU yellow card, there's been a lot of pressure. There's been a lot of pressure on Thailand to make those changes. If the EU puts a red card on Thailand, then a number of European countries will just put a ban on Thai seafood. So it's a really big thing for them. So they have tightened up. They have tightened up the laws, and then also worked with a number of like the International Labour Organisation and a number of other sort of bodies to be able to understand what best practice looks like. So they put a model boat together, and I think also Thai Union was part of it. So there was a group of people who then put this boat together, and they went around to all the different ports and essentially educated all of the industry about what an adequately fitted out boat should look like. I'd have toilets, for instance, but just to show them and to help educate them. So it's having adequate laws, and then it's also the enforcement and oversight of that as well.
Have you seen any organisations preparing kind of like an independence criteria that is a verification and an assurance sort of mark? Like there's also
there's an ISO accreditation. Actually, I should maybe include that in when I do this again. So there's an ISO accreditation now that it's not actually a certification, but it's a guideline about sustainable procurement. You can buy it online. I think it costs about $75. But it's actually a really good starting point. Australia and New Zealand have both signed up to it, and it gives a starting point as both as an education tool, so that people can understand, why sustainable procurement is important, but then all of the different elements, not just of social and environmental, but also economic and governance. So looking a little bit at anti-bribery, anti-corruption, those types of things as well. So it's a really good starting point, and it's got some good tools in there about where you should at least start and where you should place your focus initially. So some of those documents that we put together for Ausgrid were quite heavily developed off the back of that ISO accreditation. But one of the issues that has been to date is just no common agreement about, what good practice looks like. That ISO document was only released a year ago, so all this is really quite new. If you were to ask me, could I name an organisation that's doing this really well that we could uphold as a, rising star, and I couldn't really tell you one. I talk about Ausgrid, that they're making great progress in the things that they're implementing, and that there's a number of organisations doing that, but I wouldn't be able to tell you any that were really mature.
I just want to ask you about the ETI in the EU, so the Ethical Trading Initiative.
Oh, yeah.
Unit, yeah. I don't know if anyone here knows better. Yeah, it might be a starting point though too for some people to look at.
Yeah, the ethical trade. There's also the other is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So some of our clients, I guess they've been, as well as being compliant with the modern slavery legislation and using that as a baseline, also being a signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals is another thing that they put. It's quite aspirational to actually become a member, but there are building blocks. You can just become just starting out, and then work your way up. So there's a number of different tools and support as well.
Got a question from someone online, and maybe we'll have this question and another one from the audience here if someone's dying to ask another question. Social media has allowed consumers to be more aware of supply chain practices. How does a brand protect itself from the spread of inaccurate or misrepresented information about its supply chain?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I guess just as much as, as I mentioned before about the example about an airline having been caught with palm oil in their ingredients in one of their snacks, just as much as you can take that information out there, so can the organisation put counter information out there. I guess the thing to worry about is when they're right, and quite often they are. I guess it's a big risk, to be exposed in that way. So, I guess if an organisation is taking the right steps to tackle these risks, then social media can be a tool for that organisation just as much as it can for consumers if they're going to misuse it as well. So, I mean, some of the retailers that we interviewed as part of our university research are doing some fantastic work. I know Coles in Australia. If you were to ask me, and I can't comment in New Zealand, but in Australia, if you were to ask me what's the most ethical brand of tin tuna could I buy, I'd say Coles Home Brand. That's my personal opinion. I'd say Coles Home Brand because I know that they source their tuna from 22 vessels, only 22 approved vessels that have CCTV on board. I can't comment on the taste and quality. I don't eat it, but it's I don't eat tuna, I should say. But yeah, it's they don't tend to publicise that as much as they should, and I guess the risk in publicising it is that when you're doing great work online, it's an ocean to boil. So where you're putting excellent work on one hand, then the T's they stop or whatever could potentially be pointed at on the other. So I think it can be used as a marketing tool, but it's a risk as well.
Kate, in New Zealand, you may well be aware of this, others may certainly be, in New Zealand has been using sustainability as a core one of their key pillars and platforms for reform and change in the organisation. Been very strongly led from the top. And just recently, very specifically to your topic, they've taken prawns off their menus because of specific failure that they identified in examining their supply chain with regards to sustainability and the like. The supply chain was at fault, and their immediate action was no prawns off the menu, so you won't have any prawns now on your international flights with Air New Zealand. So that's a very recent example, but they've been building up to that over the last couple of years. So there's some good examples in New Zealand that if people want to look out for, they can find.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
They're very free and positive. I'm not promoting them per se, but they're very engaged.
That's okay. I did this exact presentation at the Air New Zealand executive offsite today.
There you go. All right, okay.
They also understand that if you're going to market yourself as your brand, as a sustainable brand, then you need to be looking at your supply chain inputs, and that you can't be seen to be buying from unethical sources and then having a reputation of being a sustainable organisation. I think they could definitely be held up as a good example. Yeah.
So if you'd like to join us for one last question.
Sorry, you may have covered it at the beginning, I'm sorry I was a little late. The commentary seems to argue that audits sometimes miss things, especially those known in advance. From the research you've done, what do you think? You've identified the risk you believe are in your supply chain. What's the best way of actually getting to the bottom of the materiality of them?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is about having that end-to-end transparency, and it's a really long process it's a really difficult thing to achieve, and one of the reasons why the modern slavery legislation was opposed by some of the big corporates was because just the amount of effort that needs to be taken to trace your supply chain. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. You know, once those things are in place, then it becomes a lot easier to maintain, and perhaps it's something that should be supported by government. But you know, through the technology that I mentioned before around surveying, you can do it in a more targeted way. So you don't send out a survey and say, how many slaves have you got in your supply chain? But you send out a survey asking them, do your workers have access to a union voice? Do your workers, do they have different types of social support? Are they paid the minimum wage in the local area? And then we ask for verification of their policies and those types of things. And then it's a self-assessed questionnaire that you can ask it in certain ways that can pick up red flags, and then you can, in a more targeted way, audit your suppliers and your suppliers. The trickiest part is your suppliers' contractors, and you know, Apple's been hammered around that with Foxconn and then subcontractors to Foxconn, and just trying for Apple to have visibility is a really, really difficult thing.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you.